Okay, welcome. I'd like to introduce our first guest speaker of 2026. Her name is Carie Behounek. She is a writer, a mindfulness teacher, and cheerleader for creative types. She spent her career helping businesses communicate their missions, and she spent the last decade immersed in quote unquote capital H healing to finally embrace her most real and authentic self. She shares her story of how mindfulness practices helped her rebuild a supportive, healthy foundation with the hope it'll resonate and help others navigate this human experience. Take it away, Carie.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate it and this opportunity to share. This is the first time I've ever really shared from a vulnerable state, my story. Speaking as a writer, I tend to, uh, use my written word. So I want to tell you a story today about this moment that I was able to see very clearly the tremendous role I was playing in my own suffering. So it was 2013. And I was laying on this really comfy couch in my living room, had a soft blanket over me. My dog, who I loved to pieces, was snuggled at my feet, and my only child was sitting in front of me in this lavender unicorn chair. She was watching TV. She was giggling at the antics of Daddy and Peppa Pig. And she was just all smiles. And she was glancing back at me occasionally to see if I was watching. And she'd offer me a Cheerio, or just making sure that I was also paying attention to the show that she was watching. But what she didn't know is that her mom is a very, very gifted time traveler. And as a time traveler, in my mind, I was back at the doctor's office and I was listening to him tell me that I was too sick to have any more kids. In my mind, I was picturing this future of a little girl who sat in front of me, devoid of any siblings, all because my body had quit functioning properly. And so I was traveling backwards. I was envisioning all these blood tests, these MRIs, these trips to the pharmacy, these inconclusive tests. And then I was fast forwarding all the way into my future. And I could only see this sick version of me, the one who couldn't be a good parent, the one who wasn't able to work, the one who, wasn't able to live this really busy and achievement based life, exciting, fun thing that she had wanted because she was too sick to do so. And so I came back to this present moment and I remember I was turning my back and I felt this new pain just sear through my body. And it was like the pain I had been experiencing for a while, but it was so much stronger and so much more severe. And that's the thing about pain, right? Physical, emotional, anything. It demands that we feel it. And so suddenly I saw myself watching these thoughts that I was having about my brain. And, I was just true that this single moment of true pain took me way out of my warm and cozy living room with my beautiful daughter and my dog. And I started catastrophizing my entire life. The pain was just so sharp, and I wasn't sure if I'd be able to work. I wasn't sure I'd be able to even, take her to preschool or to her play dates. And, was I going to be in a wheelchair by the time I to take her to kindergarten? And the funny thing is, though, is that was the first time I actually noticed myself noticing how this narrator in my head was going on and on and on and on and on. And really, where I was completely safe. I hurt, but I was safe. So, months before this started, I had started to listen to guided meditations. It was kind of an act of desperation. Before I had gotten sick, which happened pretty soon after she was born, I managed my anxiety by staying busy, by shopping, by numbing out. I managed my anxiety and depression by punishing my body, like through boot camp classes and miserable runs, and then, bottle of wine every night when I was cooking and all of the things. And my body had quit working. And so I had constant pain and I had constant fatigue. And I spent weeks of my life in bed. I was seeing so many specialists. I couldn't keep track of them. I had this brain fog that I had no idea, what doctor was where and how I was going to get there. And all that the doctors could tell me was that it was autoimmune. So my body was attacking itself. And they put me on a ton of medications. Again, sometimes medications to manage the medications, the side effects of the medications that they put me on. I was a mess. And it definitely wasn't this life that I had so carefully planned for myself. here's the funny thing about this story is that morning I'd had a really good day. I had met this deadline on an article I was writing for my client and they loved it. I felt well enough to walk my kid to the park. We played, we sang, there's this little wooden playhouse and we were making soup and we were feeding it to the dog who came with us. And it was a clear blue Colorado sky. If you've been to Colorado, you know that clear blue. It's just so vibrant. And it was a really magical morning of me being, the mom, the present mom that I wanted to be, and also being able to provide for my child, which was important. I needed to earn an income in order to, for us to live. So, but by the time we got home, my body was just complete toast, and it took all of my energy just to pour Cheerios in a little cup and pour her some milk. And so, in addition to all those time traveling thoughts, ruminating on my past, and trying to predict this unknown future, I started into this downward spiral. And then the only thing that I can really describe it as and it's funny because I'm actually in a room where the light turns off every 15 minutes. So you might see me stand up and turn it back on. But the only way that I can describe this moment in my life is that it's like somebody came in and they turned a light on in the room. And all of a sudden, since I had started listening to these meditations, which I didn't believe in, I thought it was all super woo woo. That was not who I was as a human. I didn't believe that things like this could actually help me. But all of a sudden, I'm noticing that just like the suggestions in the guided meditations of watching your thoughts come and watching your thoughts go, all of a sudden I was doing it. Had some distance between myself and those thoughts. And I noticed for the first time that I wasn't just the narrator. I was somebody who was watching this narrator go on and on and on about all of my trials and tribulations. And so noticing this and then noticing how far I was going into the past and then heading into the future, I also noticed that it wasn't helpful. It wasn't helpful at all. And for the first time in my entire life, I noticed that there was this space and there was a choice. And I saw this choice point, which is just that minuscule pause between your thoughts that are just coming and coming and coming and coming, where it brought some clarity to this fact that I could actually be choosing different thoughts at this moment. I could be choosing to reinforce how much I'm suffering. And I was suffering. I was in so much pain. Having brain fog is a terrible thing. But I could also choose thoughts that focus more on the gratitude of having this one morning where I actually felt really good. And it was very different from the weeks that I experienced up until that point. So I knew for the first time in my life that I could shift my attention toward what was good. I could be present in this room where I was safe, my daughter was safe, my dog was there with us. She's feeding the dog, all of her Cheerios, no big deal. It still very much sucked that I hurt. Still very much sucked that I was really tired. But this moment of clarity was truly became this point for this foundation for me to just be curious and to be curious about how all of these thoughts were actually contributing to making me more miserable. Eventually, I began to see, and these are not things that happen sequentially and fast. These are over years of time. But I was able to start seeing with a lot of practice how my actions, how my behaviors, how my beliefs, and the big one for me was my emotions, how those are all contributing to pain. And then I began to notice that my entire life experience was actually based on where I was placing my attention. And it's not to negate the bad things that were happening in my life. These things were they were very difficult at this point in my life. But I could place my attention in other places too. And that I had a choice to do that. And that any choice I was making had a consequence. So even though I had this actual physical pain that was trapping me, and not only was it trapping me in the physical pain of it, but these cycles of anxiety that I had no idea how to manage, these cycles of depression that were very, very dark and truly scary for me. I just, I got the help with my doctors. I got help with all the spaces that I could externally. And then I really started to focus inwardly. And serendipitously, about this time, I got assigned an article. And it was about this group of nurses. So I'm a health and science writer. And I got assigned this article about this group of nurses from Duke University that were experiencing this really highly burned out, chaotic. They were highly unhappy. They all were having mental health issues. They were all experiencing, not all, but some of them were experiencing issues with addiction. And so this researcher came in and did this project that he called Three Good Things. And so he had this group of nurses who were very reluctant to do this, to take any time at all in their lives to sit down and actually write about three things that went well in their day, and didn't even have to be well, right? It could just be something that was neutral, something that wasn't horrible, something you could just appreciate, like a hot cup of coffee. And they did this for a few weeks, and this researcher followed them. And then the post assessment of all of this is that even though nothing in their environment had changed at all, their perspective had shifted, and many of them were starting to see their symptoms of burnout actually improving. So I thought, oh, gosh, if this works for those nurses at Duke, like why couldn't this work for me, right? I was still in pain, but I started to find some ways of practicing appreciation. Started to journal. I wrote down all the bad stuff just to get it out of my system, right? I mean, I have pages and pages and pages of just pure anger and frustration and all the things. But then I always ended it with like, okay, but you know what? The sky was blue today. The sun came up. Trying to find that more positive thing. And I've always been a pretty positive person, mainly because I just have this really deep desire to be loved. And I'll get to that in a minute here. But this newfound ability to be present with what was actually happening in my life, combined with this ability to see that I could appreciate things started to shift again. And these doors started opening that I thought had been shut. I began to see like these really small ways that actually I was pretty supported in all these things. Doors opened that were previously shut. One day I walked through this door. I waited to see a specialist for 3 months. And the day that I walked in the door, I was so excited because I thought, oh my God, finally I'm going to see a doctor who's going to actually be able to help me. And sure enough, I get there. The receptionist checks me in and says, oh, honey, we just got this fax that came through and we no longer accept your insurance. And I lost it. And I don't cry. I used to brag all the time. I don't cry. I'm not a crier. I just, I have no reason to cry. I burst into tears in the middle of this waiting room, like sobbing. And this receptionist comes out from behind her desk and she gives me a hug. And I was so embarrassed and just mortified that I was crying. I mean, I grew up on a farm. We did not cry. Sensitive kid, you did not belong here. We hold that stuff in, right? I'm here releasing all of this. And funny enough, the surgeon that I was meeting with happened to walk by and he was like, what's going on? And he like legit was like, well, this one's on me. Come on in. It ended up not being the right solution for me, but I started then again to see like, wow, you know what? I'm paying attention and I'm trusting my path. And sure enough, like these doors open that weren't previously there. So a little bit later on down the road, I'm still practicing my meditation. I'm starting to feel better. I get the right combination of meds. I'm seeing a therapist. I'm doing all these things, right? And so I take this class called mindfulness-based stress reduction. And one of the classes, they do this body scan. And so I'm doing this body scan, and she tells us to focus on our left ankle. And I focus in on my left ankle. And all of a sudden, I just really let myself truly feel the pain that was there. I didn't know if you had asked me before, does your left ankle hurt? I wouldn't have said that. And it was excruciating. And I started to cry. And not only did I start to cry, I couldn't stop crying. I literally cried for days after. I thought I was broken. I honestly just thought they're gonna put me away. Like they're gonna think I'm crazy because I can't stop crying. I can't stop now that I've started. But an interesting thing about that was that the more I released my emotions, the more my physical pain started to dissipate. And so that's kind of my origin story as it relates to, as Michael mentioned, the capital H healing story. I started to refocus, and doing that took me pretty far. It really helped me get curious about what I was actually experiencing and where I was placing that kind of attention. It also came with this huge side effect that I began to see how much all of those thoughts that I was now noticing and watching fly by were guided by two things: my emotions and my impulses. And both of those things, my emotions and my impulses, were heavily impacted by a history of trauma that I had just not dealt with. And so I started down the pathway of trauma healing, which if you had asked me before, I probably would have been like, oh, no, 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 no trauma here. None. Nope, it's good. We're good. We're good. Uh, and anyway, that helped me to recognize that I was leaving so much of my life to autopilot. And it was really based on these two things. The one was my very deep desire to be loved and feeling unlovable. And this presented as martyrdom, right? Like, I will do whatever you need me to. And then, oh, but nobody loves me back. And these are terrible things to admit about yourself, but they're true. And I was a people pleaser. And, you people please, you people please, you people please. And then suddenly that leads to some volatility, which, people don't always love either. So I also recognized how much chaos felt like home to me. And I was consciously creating a lot of chaos in my life, but I was also subconsciously creating a lot of chaos in my life because it was what I was used to physically and emotionally. So there were substances, there were, these different ways that I was trying to manage and truly numb out all of these things. And so I started down this path of just being radically accountable for all of it. I kept releasing, I kept noticing these patterns that I was having in my life. And it included all these really subconscious ways or these ways that I was somewhat conscious of, but mostly it was subconscious of how like I was actually self harming myself in so many ways. It would boil up and it would boil over. And the more I became accountable, and again, I'm talking years, these are not these overnight changes, right? But the more I became accountable, the more I was able to actually discern the things that I was doing, right? The people that were for me, the places that were for me, the things that were for me. And then all the things that weren't, and all the ways I was making supportive choices in my life. But then there were so many ways that I also made unsupportive choices. And so I experimented then with a lot of different healing modalities. I did therapy, I did group therapies, medications, I did psilocybin, yoga, writing poetry, huge spiritual surrender. And one of the biggest things that I learned how to do is actually regulate my nervous system. I didn't realize I was living my entire life. Speaking of massages, Michael, you mentioned that and the release that you get from that, right? And I had no idea. I remember getting massages and they have their elbow on me, like, I had no idea I was even that tense. There's a light going off. Um, and so I began to regulate my nervous system. And over time, and with a lot of practice, I really started seeing, again, these choice points, these ways that I was making choices that supported who I wanted to be as a human, and these ways that I was making just these truly unsupportive. But, I woke up this morning and I looked over and my daughter is now 15. And I often express to her, like, I'm just so grateful. I'm a single mom. I'm so grateful that she's getting this version of me as a teenager, because she had her first experience, at a party recently over Halloween. And, she's getting this version of a mom who, I'm not perfect. Gosh, I'm so far from being perfect. But what she's getting is a mom who's really present and I'm not constantly time traveling when I'm with her. I'm not constantly just letting these subconscious ways of being and doing and showing up, govern how I'm moving through life. And, I still have my moments where I'm worrying about the future or ruminating about the past. I still have moments of autopilot. Like, I just drove home. How the hell did I get here? And I still make plenty of unsupportive choices. And in fact, it's after Christmas and made a lot of unsupportive choices over the holiday season, but I'm aware of it. And I'm also showing my kid now that, just being present in the life that you have, there is so much to offer and that you have to offer the world where you're not continually abandoning yourself and really truly, that sounds as the girl who started those guided meditations 15 years ago is rolling her eyes right now at me, but it's true. That's like really finding this self-love that I didn't actually know I had. So thank you all for letting me share my story. As a writer, I have spent the last 20 years sharing and witnessing stories of people who have moved through addiction, who have moved through mental health issues. I spent the briefest of time for 3 years. I worked for a nonprofit restaurant, and we serve people who are experiencing poverty and homelessness. And even though I did the marketing, right, like who's there gets called up, and so I did some front of house, I did the back house, I did it all, not very well, and so I know the people though that are drawn to that work. You guys are able to so very easily, you make it like easy managing chaos every single day, and just those brief moments that I've spent in that. And then again, as a farmer's daughter, I grew up during the farm crisis of the 1980s and in a really depressed economy and in a depressed town. And my family was lucky; we didn't lose our farm, but many of our neighbors did. And so I just really appreciate all the ways that you show up for the rest of the world. And I'm really hopeful that by sharing my story of learning how I contributed to my own suffering throughout this life, maybe there's something that resonates with one of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carie. Thank you for sharing your story. We're gonna stop the recording and we're gonna open up the meeting for questions and answers.